Okay, well I have a little PowerPoint here. I'm going to pull up on the screen. So that I can give you a bit of an overview and an introduction to fiction. And I know a lot of you enjoy reading fiction, but to the kind of literary study of fiction, I wanted to discuss that a little bit. So, what is fiction? So, from an anthology of fiction that I like to use in a lot of my classes called short fiction, the introduction says, on the one hand, fiction is simply made-up stories, in other words, lies. On the other, fiction is a kind of artistic expression that answers the question, what if? So, as fantastic as a story can be, I know Burroway was mentioning that everything we write has an element of ourselves and an element of truth in it. But also, no matter how outlandish a piece of fiction is, it's always kind of answering the question, what if? Which goes kind of along with what Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, says, that it is a poet's job or a writer's job to show not what is, but what could or should be. So we're depicting the world as it could be. Burroway, from your reading, also says you started learning to write at the latest as soon as you were born. So it's our natural human instinct to invent these kind of stories or interpretations of what the world could be. And Stephen King, in his essay on what writing is, from his book On Writing, says that writing is telepathy. And what he means by that, and in this essay, it's a very powerful depiction of writing, where he eventually says that you shouldn't come lightly to the page, because writing is this endeavor that we take by making these kind of white or black markings on white paper, which transmit our ideas, our philosophies, our images from our minds to another person's. So you can be sitting somewhere in a completely different time period and have an idea, and through the act of writing you can transmit that into the mind of someone else. So it is this kind of very serious endeavor, fiction, even though on the surface it seems kind of ultimately like making believe, making things up, lying, playing at the same time. Okay, the other element that I want to talk about is plot. According to Aristotle, plot is the most important element. Nowadays, in more contemporary fiction, we often say that the most important element is character, but we should think about our plots as we begin to write. Traditional plot lines that you've probably seen follow that triangular example of the plot diagram, where you have some exposition, which starts out, which is, background information about the characters, the setting, anything like that. And then we lead to the rising action, which leads to the climax, which Aristotle calls the reversal. So when things change from good to bad or bad to good. And then after that reversal or climax, you have the falling action and eventually the resolution or the denouement. Now, these plots can be episodic, which means kind of one thing comes after the next, or they can be more complex, which means everything happens because something else happens. Now, in Aristotle's book Poetics, he talks about how everything should be very connected and tied and follow these traditional plot lines. But I want you to feel free to explore and experiment with different kinds of plot. I've listed here some writers who work with these kind of non-traditional plots. One of them is considered to be the mother of the British short story, Catherine Mansfield, and she often writes plots that just kind of end at the climax without even telling you what happens, or the turn. She has a story where, for instance, where a boy watches a girl out of his window, and the story ends just as he's about to knock on her door. Gertrude Stein, on the other hand, her stories are all language in an almost poetic way. A lot of times the sentences, she is a poet, so the sentences won't even connect to each other. You're left to kind of wander in this landscape of imagery without really any plot. Sandra Cisneros, in the story Barbecue, she's just kind of describing toys, so you get what ends up to be just a lot of exposition, and you wondering, where is the plot in this? And Girl, those of you who've read Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, is just a series of instructions from a mother to her daughter about how to behave. So the point of that is, and you probably know more stories than these or books that kind of challenge and play with these traditional plot ideas that we have, that a story must have its beginning, middle, and end, and it must have a climax. But I would say just embrace your own voice and your own instincts, because most contemporary writers play with plot in some way. So feel free to experiment and to play with plot as you begin thinking about what you're going to write about. So conflict is another really important element of fiction that I want to talk about, and conflict is ultimately the thing that drives the plot. It's in control of the plot, and even behind stories that don't seem to have that more traditional plot line, there usually is some kind of tension or conflict that's happening between the characters. So I've given you a few examples from the reading that's due this week and from other stories. So an example from our reading, which you'll see is The Private Landscape, but another example would be Susan Sontag's Dummy, where the protagonist of that story deals with his internal struggle of finding happiness and wanting to not be part of the American dream. So he creates kind of dummies to do all of the work that he doesn't want to do and live his life and kind of be married to his wife and hang out with his kids, so he can basically live like a homeless person. So the struggle in that story is entirely internal, because most of the characters don't really feel the conflict outside of what's happening with him. And then external would be kind of Borges's story, The Other Duel, where it is about war, and it's about two characters who hate each other so much that they do all of these terrible things to each other, and eventually they're made to run a race where their throats are slit and they kind of just fall over. So all of the conflict there is done to the characters. Of course, they have this internal struggle of hating each other, but what we see is that doesn't really matter. It's the external kind of forces or conflicts which are causing the plot to drive forward. They're not doing it. So Bigfoot Stole My Wife too, you could say, goes either way. So pay attention to that. Is the conflict inside your characters, or is it outside? And to do this, you may start just kind of daydreaming or thinking about characters before you even start to begin to think about how you're going to play with plot and conflict. Which kind of leads to a discussion of point of view. I've put this handy chart here to help you decide whether a narrative is written in first or third, and I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with the ideas about point of view. First person, you can have either a reliable or unreliable narrator. So your character can be someone we completely trust. Everything that they describe, we take at face value, or your character can be someone that is telling us things and we wonder, are they telling us all of the information? Here I gave the example of William Carlos Williams' The Use of Force, in which a doctor talks about his treatment of a young girl, and in the story he's saying that everything he's doing is normal and that the girl is a brat and all of these other things, but we can see as outsiders that he's kind of unreliable and he's using too much force and he's getting kind of creepy about it. So you walk that line between creating a narrator that you can trust and you can't, but either way you should have a purpose behind it. So William Carlos Williams' purpose ultimately was to make us think about the use of force and the justifications for the use of force. Second person is the use of you. If any of you have read Choose Your Own Adventure novels, it's that kind of thing. This rarely works, especially in literary fiction. You can experiment with it, but it usually ends up sounding kind of cheesy. So use at your own risk, I guess I would say. Third person can still be unreliable, so we can have this sort of narrator that we're not sure is showing us everything that we should see. I gave the example of The Rose for Emily because that third person narrative seems to be biased in many ways about the society in which Emily lives and about Emily herself. He calls her Miss Emily, or the narrator, and views her as the town would, which is this sort of, treating her like she's perfectly harmless, but in the end we find out that she has this kind of dark, grotesque secret that she's been keeping. So Aristotle, we'll come back to him and because I love his book Poetics, which really lays out kind of these great pillars to either keep or break for literature. But he says to ask yourself what is necessary and appropriate for your point of view to know and tell the audience. So if you choose, for instance, to make your point of view from a child, what would the child know? What would be necessary for the child to tell the audience? And what would be appropriate? What would the child actually say? So think about deeply into the way that you're telling your story beyond just the plot and conflict and character. So language, a lot of the other terms on your handout this week that you should go through have to do with this idea of language. That's metaphor, symbol, all of those other things that deal with the actual telling of the story beyond just those kind of mechanical aspects. Burroway, in the article we read last week, says, the trick is that if you write in words that evoke the senses, if your language is full of things that can be seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched, you create a world your reader can enter. And ultimately that's what you want, going back to that idea of telepathy, is you want to transmit the world that you have in your head into the head of your reader. And without these kind of sensory images, you can't do that. On the other hand, you can go too far into what we call purple prose, which is kind of very richly describing every single thing so that it becomes excessive. So there is a fine line between describing something, allowing someone to see it, and just going overboard with the detail so that it's overwhelming and we kind of lose the meaning. And I wanted to read you something from the homework reading this week, because I think Melissa Pritchard does a really good job of having very rich language, but at the same time not kind of going into that purple prose area. And this passage I'm going to read you is from page 131. And she says, at some moment during summer's peak, the garden overreaches its own ripeness. So there we can see the personification of the garden overreaching. Vegetation hangs exhausted, overcome by its own lush growth. This is my least favorite time of year, when the harvest is forgotten, unpicked tomatoes split open on trailing imperfect vines. This is also my least favorite wedge of the afternoon, between noon and 4 o'clock, an empty glaring period for me. I can, with some accuracy, match my own age and season to this month and this hour. From the porch where I sit, pinned to my chair by humidity, more potent than gravity, I see the white horse standing inert and passive. I always envisioned horses as magnificent, dream-like creatures, rearing heavenward, manes swirling like seagrass. It is not so. A horse passes its time like most anything else, placid, concerned only with whatever passes before its eyes. The horse, sapped by domesticity, confined by fences, has disillusioned me. I expected more from it. So we can enter into that moment of her feeling about the horse there because of the rich language of it, and even just the rhythm of her language is almost poetic there. So take some time while you're reading, and even while you're reading other things that aren't part of our homework reading that particularly grab you, and think about how they're trying to engage the senses, how they're trying to communicate an image to you, to pull you into a feeling or emotion using these kind of sensory details, and try as much as you can to bring that into your own writing. And this is part of your homework or your discussion post for this week, is to find a particularly moving passage in a book or story you like and post that on the discussion board by Wednesday, and then explain why this passage is moving using language from the handout. Be sure you're pulling in that language, and then remember to comment on at least 2 other people's posts. So I think that's it for this week. Remember, keep up on your blog, get that posted by Friday. If you want to read other people's blogs, those are available to you too. Just hit that drop down window, which is on the right side, and you can see other people's blogs and comment on them. It's not required, but it kind of will help you understand what other people might be thinking about the reading too. And don't forget your discussion board post and those words. So have a great week.